Colonel Gibby, welcome to Constituting America's Constitutional Chats. We're so excited to have you with us today as we celebrate the Army's 250th birthday. And we want to give you a few minutes for opening comments, and then we'll go to our board member, Jay McConville, for some comments and questions, and then just rotate through the panel. And I want to thank you and Jay and Jonah and all of our audience members who are serving and have served for your incredible service to our country. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy, and good afternoon to everyone and on the panel. It's really thrilling to see citizen soldiers, American citizens who volunteer to serve our nation, wear our country's cloth, to serve honorably, and even after service within the armed forces, to continue serving in a venture like this. I'm just really thrilled to be invited to this podcast. From the time I was very young, I was always drawn to the idea of service for the country and love of country and patriotism. So it's wonderful to be invited to talk about this very special occasion, the Army's 250th birthday. As I start, I just want to underscore that the views that I'm going to talk about are mine alone and do not necessarily reflect those of the United States Army, the Military Academy, or the Department of Defense. But aside from that, I'm very excited to speak about the United States Army and its history of defending our great republic. Just to think, 250 years, the Army is an institution that's even older than the country itself. And I think that's a fact that very few Americans either know or they appreciate, that the Army was in existence for an entire year before the Declaration of Independence was signed and the country declared its independence from Great Britain. So to start talking about the history of the Army, I think it's important to know or to start that Americans, or rather British subjects, because we were all subjects of the British King, living in the 13 North American colonies who wanted to be independent from Great Britain, were in revolt in the spring of 1775, precisely because they did not want to have a professional standing army in their community. Many believed in the traditions which we had borrowed from England, in local militias or part-time soldiers who were called to defend their homes only during times of emergencies. And then when the crisis was over, they demobilized and they returned to be farmers, shopkeepers, clergymen, or daytime workers. Armies were considered oppressive and the tool of an unjust king, which is what appeared to be the case in the spring of 1775. So, for those of us who know our colonial history well, we know that the crisis in the American colonies begins long before April 19th, 1775, but that was the day when we had the shot heard around the world at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts. The British king was so angry at this outburst of rebellion that he sent a large number of soldiers that they were known kind of informally as redcoats, or more likely as lobster backs. The red of a lobster being reflected in the color of their uniform. And he sent these soldiers to put down the rebellion, and also to make Boston, the city of Boston, pay for all the damages that had been inflicted. In response, thousands of militiamen, also known as Minutemen, from the colonies of New Hampshire and Connecticut and Rhode Island and Massachusetts, they all left their homes, their families, and they rallied around Boston to try to force the British to leave. Meanwhile, at the same time in Philadelphia, in the colony of Pennsylvania, men like Benjamin Franklin and John Adams had recognized that the colonies needed a good army, not just an army of good men, if they were going to win their independence from Great Britain. So they looked around in the Continental Congress, and they saw a tall Virginian wearing the uniform of his own colonial militia. His name was George Washington. And on June 14th, 1775, the Continental Congress voted to establish the Continental Army with General Washington as its very first commander-in-chief. So that's how our Army is born, and that's why we celebrate June 14th as the Army's birthday. The Continental Army played a key part to win American independence by 1781, when the British surrendered at Yorktown in Virginia. But you'll remember, Americans didn't like armies, so the Continental Army was disbanded And for many years, the United States had a very small and not very good army. The War of 1812, which was fought against Great Britain again, showed everyone that armies may be expensive to have in peacetime, but they were more expensive not to have in times of crisis or war. Following the conclusion of the War of 1812, which is when the British burned down Washington, D.C., the American government took steps to create a permanent national army that could do a lot of different things, such as defend the East Coast, negotiate with Indian tribes in the West, ensure peace and stability on the frontier, and keep the British, the French, and the Spanish out of the land that we wanted to reserve for American expansion in the early 19th century. Another key step that was taken was the creation of a national military academy established at West Point, New York, which had been a special fort during the American Revolution. Thomas Jefferson, our third president, signed the legislation to create the United States Military Academy in 1802. In 1817, a West Point graduate named Sylvanus Thayer became the superintendent, which is a lot like being a college president. He decided to make West Point a special place to educate, train, and inspire young men from across America to be Army officers. And so he developed a 4-year college curriculum heavy on engineering, math, science, French language, and history. Since then, West Point has produced many officers that are and graduates that are well known in American history, such as Ulysses S. Grant, William T. Sherman, John J. Pershing, George S. Patton, Omar Bradley, Dwight D. Eisenhower, Douglas MacArthur, David Petraeus, and Lloyd Austin being some of the more recent. After the War of 1812, West Point graduates in the United States Army played significant roles in 3 major conflicts: the Mexican-American War, the American Civil War, and the Spanish-American War. The Mexican-American War lasted for 2 years, from 1846 to 1848. And at the end of that war, the American nation had increased its size by a large amount, adding land that would become the states of Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, Nevada, Utah, and Colorado. American soldiers also guarded the Northwest United States, ensuring that Washington State and Oregon would not become part of Canada. In 1861, the United States Army fought the Civil War that lasted 4 years against the Confederate States of America. This was a very difficult time for the Army and the nation. Their major battles included Bull Run, Shiloh, Antietam, Fredericksburg, Gettysburg, Vicksburg, the Wilderness, Cold Harbor, and Petersburg. When the war was over, the United States Army was huge. It had over 600,000 men in uniform. In fact, it took 2 days for the federal troops of the United States to parade down Pennsylvania Avenue in the nation's capital at the end of the war. So by this time, the American Army can be considered a modern force. Americans from all walks of life rallied to defend the Union, including more than 200,000 African Americans and many newly arrived immigrants. The Army had learned how to organize and deploy large formations of men, horses, supplies, ammunition, and guns, and then to send these armies deep into enemy territory to fight major battles to fulfill the nation's strategy. Whereas previous wars were fought with smoothbore muskets and cannon, Civil War soldiers carried rifles with much greater range and accuracy. The nation's industry was mobilized to manufacture large amounts of clothing, food, ammunition, steamships, trains, and even balloons. And the Army used telegraphs to communicate over long distances. And our officers learned that to lead free American citizens as soldiers, you had to be humane, intelligent, and compassionate. Going into the 20th century, the United States Army fought 2 major wars that were global. In both wars, we did not want to get involved, and so when they started, we were not very well prepared. But we still organized more than 1 million men to fight in France in 1917 and 1918 during World War I, and then over 8 million men to fight against Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan in World War II. After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii on December 7, 1941, the Army mobilized itself like never before to fight on land, at sea, and in the air around the world for 4 long years. At the end of that war, the United States hoped not to have to fight again, but in places like Korea and Vietnam, American soldiers went to war to support the nation's strategy to contain and resist communism during the Cold War. And at this time, other soldiers were living in West Germany, Japan, or other locations around the world. So everyone was really busy. The collapse of the Berlin Wall in November 1989 and the fall of the Soviet Union in December 1991 ended the Cold War, but the Army was still busy. This was the time that I entered West Point and became an Army officer. When I graduated high school, I didn't know the Army's motto was, "This will defend." But that is what I wanted to do. President Ronald Reagan said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." And I heard him say that. And I wanted to serve my country and defend my fellow citizens. I wanted to be someone who helped others who couldn't defend themselves. So for the past 32 years, I've done that. And my career as a soldier has followed the Army's history in the 1990s and during the global war on terror in the 21st century. I've been deployed to places like Panama, Korea, twice to Iraq, and to Spain. I worked with allies in the Pacific, in the Middle East, and in NATO. I've spent nights being cold and wet and days being hot and thirsty. And when I was hungry, I ripped open a pouch labeled "meal ready to eat." Yum. No, not really. But when that was all over, I always remembered what we were defending: our liberties and freedoms as American citizens, our homes and families, our way of life to do and say pretty much what we felt like doing and saying. So to kind of close up, I just want to go back to the 18th century, the late 18th century, where this story all starts. John Adams from Massachusetts had said that he studied war and politics so his children could learn music and mathematics. I think that's really sums up for many of us what service in the United States Army is. We serve because we want others to be able to enjoy the blessing of a free society. So to cap it all off, let's say loud and thunderous happy birthday, United States Army. And let's hope that 200 years from now, there can be another celebration that's even bigger and better than this one. So thank you again for the invitation to come and speak on this program.
Well, thank you. And thank you again for your service. And you're just using your years of experience and service to the country to train our next generation of cadets. And it's just so important that we all understand our history and understand, where our Army came from. And we really appreciate, I mean, that's just such a great overview that you gave. And Jay, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Kathy, and thank you, Colonel Gibby, for giving your time so generously to our podcast here. We really appreciate you doing that, but I also wanted to say thank you for your service, and also specifically for the work that you're doing to understand the history of the Army and to pass that along to a new generation of soldiers. That is so important, that we understand the context of how we serve and why we serve. And as a
Right.
veteran myself of the Army, and very proud of that, I'm glad to see somebody of your caliber there to take the new generations and really give them that appreciation. So thank you for that. Constituting America, we concentrate on the Constitution, obviously, and we have robust discussions often about the origins of our nation. And you mentioned early on the origins of the Army, derived from local militias that were extant when we were still in the colonies. I had written a paper not too long ago about that, or about at least partly about that, and the development of the professional Continental Army. I was quoting from Rob Orison. He's a historian, just a historian of the Army, and he had mentioned that we tend to have a sort of romanticized vision of the Minutemen and the militia, and tend to underrepresent the effort that George Washington went through to form a professional army. And while the Minutemen were great and the militia was important, he says the Continental Army is really what won the war. I wonder if you could comment on that.
Sure, it's a very good question, and I chuckle because I remember as a 10-year-old, reading a fifth grade textbook on American history for fun. It'd been written in the 1950s, and it had that kind of that flavor of the Minuteman tradition being the backbone of the American Army, which has some truth to it. But the reality was that the American Revolution was only going to be won when the British empire, and that's something that we often don't reflect on. We were fighting against the most powerful empire on the world. The sun never set on the British Empire in the late 18th century. So we were taking on a very formidable opponent that had control of the sea, had a very large army, very well trained and experienced. And Washington knew that he needed to have a credible, standing military force that could go toe to toe with the British, and maybe not beat them on the battlefield, because Washington has actually a pretty poor record of winning versus losing on the battlefield. But he had to be able to have a force that would compel the British to recognize that these colonists are serious. This is not just, they're mad about one or two things. They really want to have their independence, and to make that kind of stick, he needed to have a professional army. And so Washington struggles with that for a long time, because the first 2 years of the war, 3 years of the war, the Continental Congress only authorizes 1-year enlistments. So you would sign up in January, and then on December 31st, your term of enlistment was over, and you left. So literally on January 1st of any given year, George Washington had no troops. He had to wait for people to actually show up. And this was why in the December of 1776, the attack on Trenton, New Jersey, was so crucial, because his army was about to just vanish in just a matter of a week. And with some very good leadership and some good speeches to his troops, he convinced a lot of them to stay on voluntarily for an extra 5 to 6 weeks, knowing that they weren't going to get paid, but that this was what they really wanted to do. And he won victories at Trenton and then in Princeton in early 1777. And so it wasn't until the next year at Valley Forge that the Continental Congress increased enlistments to up to 3 years. And that was also when Baron von Steuben arrived from Prussia, and Washington saw that, here is somebody who actually teach us how to fight in a professional European style. And Baron von Steuben from the winter of 78 to 79, those 3 or 4 months, really deserves a lot of credit for helping the Continental Army become a professionalized force that could stand toe to toe with the British. And they proved that in the summer of 79 at the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse in New Jersey.
That's excellent. Thank you for that. And I think it's really important. We have young people on the podcast, and some may be considering a career in the military. And the increase in professionalism and specialization in the military has just really been an amazing feat over these 250 years. And you had mentioned in your remarks that you felt that it was really after the Civil War where we really had a professional army of a high quality modern army. Could you just, and also I wanted to say, you and I were both military intelligence officers, and we crossed some path, though we never met, at least as far as we remember.
Right.
But for those who are thinking about, a career in the military, could you just talk to the change in professionalism in the Army in the modern times, the development of branches and specialties and that kind of thing?
Sure. When Washington organized the Continental Army, he had basically 3 branches of service, what we call infantry, artillery, and cavalry. And of those, the cavalry was very small, and the artillery wasn't much bigger. But as time went on, the Army recognized it needed to be able to do more things than just those we call them the combat arms. You needed to have a sustainment and a supporting branch. And for the longest time in the 19th century, those functions of supply and quartermaster and transportation and communications, they were in Washington, D.C., and they weren't actually, in the Army. They were soldiers, but they weren't in the Army. They were in Washington, D.C. And it's not till the Civil War, a little bit in the Mexican-American War, where we figured out, hey, we need this service. But it's in the Civil War, really, where logistics, the ability to supply and move and sustain large numbers of troops really becomes important because of the size of the American Army and the operations that are conducted, across the continent. And so that was when the Army started to recognize that we need specialists. We need people who are educated, trained. West Point plays a big role of this in terms of engineering and topography and understanding how to use railroads, railroads and telegraphs to help the Army. So by the end of the 19th century, you have this expansion of what we call the supporting branches that deal with the things like supply, transportation, and communications. And then in the early 20th century, man figures out how to fly. And now you've introduced a whole nother dimension of aircraft and the internal combustion engine. So now we need mechanics and people who understand, how to drive cars. And this is it's kind of hard to believe in the 21st century, but just 100 years ago, that was a real novelty. And just knowing, if someone, just a random person knowing how to put air into tires, that was not something people knew how to do in the early 20th century. And so those technical specialized services continued to expand up through World War II. And then we added fields like the chemical branch, military intelligence, aviation becomes its own branch in the early 1980s. And most recently, we've added the cyber branch. So for all those, young Americans who, for them, being on a keyboard is so, it's kind of like us being on skateboards. When we were kids, it was so natural to be on a skateboard, and for them today, it's no, I'm on a keyboard. And so that's the latest of our technical specialty branches that the Army requires.
Well, thank you. I'm almost out of time. I do want to mention my son is in the Army as well. He's actually a space officer in the Army, so we've added that as well.
Yeah,
So
space.
continuing opportunities for education for our young people through the service has been a great benefit of having a professional Army of people like me who go on into industry and I was trained to be the person I am in the military. So I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you and everybody about the great United States Army, and happy 50th birthday to that. So thank you, Colonel.
Thank you. And thank you for continuing to serve our nation and doing what you're doing. It's vitally important.
It's my honor. Thanks.
Let's go to Jonah and to Wyatt.
Yes, hello. Yeah, this is White Hensley here. Just want to thank you,
Hi,
Colonel
Wyatt.
Gibby, for being on today. What a fascinating conversation to have, and perfect conversation too, to celebrate 250 years of the United States Army. I just had one quick question to just start off. When you were talking about the history of the Army and how its role has expanded,
Mhm.
one quick question. When did the U.S. Army begin to have troops stationed abroad outside of, war, just for
Right,
peacetime? When was
right.
that?
So that would have been following the Spanish-American War, which
Mm-hmm.
takes place in 1898. And as part of that was really the first war where soldiers physically leave, the North American continent. We had previously conducted expeditions to Canada. We had invaded Canada a couple times in the early history of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the war with Mexico, we conducted operations all the way to Mexico City. But in the Spanish-American War, we send troops to Cuba, we send troops to Puerto Rico, and we send troops to the Philippines. And so right after that conflict is when you see American Army garrisons, or posts is what we call them, being established overseas, mostly in the Philippines, but also in Puerto Rico. Cuba, we don't stay, very long in Cuba, but there's a substantial presence in the Philippines that lasts all the way up through World War II.
Wow, fascinating. And then, so you obviously talked about the British influence on the American Army, or whenever the colonial army. Were there other inspirations too whenever it was being created?
Yes, yes. So prior to the American Revolution, we fought in North America, it was called the French and Indian War. In Europe, they referred to it as the 7 Years' War. In North America, it's the same conflict. But in the French and Indian War, we learned a lot. The colonists from the French, Canadians, and their Indian allies in how they conducted their operations. So the British tended to take European methods, which were what we say linear, so lines of troops moving on an open field and then kind of duking it out, on a field. The French and the Indians, they did a little bit differently. They used more camouflage. They used more cover and concealment. They preferred tactics of ambush and raid over these kind of what we call set piece battles or engagements. So the colonists, they kind of had both traditions that they were looking at. Washington wanted to do more of the European style. The militiamen kind of preferred the French and Indian style because it was more independent, it was more autonomous. One of the very famous colonists in the French and Indian War was a guy named William Rogers. His Rogers Rangers was kind of his organization. He wrote a rule book that we still use today in the American Ranger School, Rogers Rules for Rangers, and has that tradition of more light infantry raids and ambushes. So that strain of that tradition is maintained in the American Revolution. So there are elements of the Continental Army, particularly the rifle units, that fight in this more open, kind of autonomous method than the regular Continental Line units did.
Interesting that, both Washington wanted to use more of the European, and then you were saying the militiamen were more in favor of the French and Indian. So kind of
Right.
interesting to see how they mixed that
Right.
and eventually used them both to win the war. So,
And the most successful battles of the American Revolution were those that had both a Continental Army presence and a militia presence, and had a leader who was flexible enough to use the strengths of both types of organizations and to use their strengths to compensate for the weaknesses that the other one had. The most famous battle is down in South Carolina at a place called Cowpens. And they're a British. It was kind of a smaller battle, but the British forces are defeated by a group of both militia and Continental Army, regular forces.
wow, yeah, I did not know that. And I mean, even just shows you then, even back then, how incredibly lucky we were to have such incredible Army leadership. I'm going to
Yeah.
hand it over to Jonah for a couple of questions.
Good afternoon, sir.
Hi, Jonah.
Just want to thank you for coming on our podcast today. It means a lot, especially being newly commissioned. I know that you deal with a lot of cadets over at West Point. I appreciate what you do for them. I went the ROTC route. I didn't go through West Point, but I did have a question.
And
on
you
who do
need to
you
be
believe?
proud of that. You need to be proud of that.
I am.
If it wasn't for the ROTC, we wouldn't have enough officers to do what we need to do in the Army.
It's very
So
true.
you're to be commended for that.
Thank you, sir. My first question is, who do you believe is the most influential Army leader and why?
Like ever?
Yeah, ever.
Okay.
Like who would you look up to the most or
Yes.
study the most?
Yeah. Okay. So it's a tie because it depends on what you want to talk about. But their first name both begins with George. So George Marshall of the 20th century and George Washington of the 18th century. And I'll tell a little bit why. So George Washington, not only is he the first commander in chief, not only is he the leader that really holds the Continental Army together. The most important thing that he did is at the end of the war. So the Battle of Yorktown had taken place, the British had surrendered, and for the next year and a half, we have negotiators in Paris that are negotiating with the British to try and end the war. Well, at this time, the Continental Congress runs out of money and they can't pay the troops and they can't pay the officers. And the officers are very upset about this because a lot of them are using their own funds to pay their soldiers and to pay for themselves to live in the field, which was expensive. And a number of them got together and said, hey, the Continental Congress, they are not doing their job. They made promises to us. They're not keeping them. What we really need is a king. And this is amazing. We just finished the war. We just defeated the British because we didn't want a king. And now these officers are saying, what we need is a king. And it needs to be Washington. He needs to be the king. So there was a movement to draft Washington to overthrow the Continental Congress. And in a tavern in the town of Newburgh, which is just north of West Point, here in New York, they get Washington in this meeting, and this group of officers, they give him a petition where it basically says the Continental Congress is, it's not doing what it's supposed to do, and we would like you, Your Excellency, that's how they refer to him, as Your Excellency, to kind of take over the government. So Washington, he and I'm gonna get emotional about this because this is so important. The whole revolution might have failed at this moment. So Washington takes the paper and he knows what it says because he's not stupid, right? He knows what it says. He knows his men have grievances. He reaches into his coat and he pulls out his glasses and he says, "Forgive me, gentlemen, my eyesight has grown dim in the service of my nation." And then they go, "Can we have that back? Can you give us that paper back?" He didn't have to say anything other than to remind them of what it was that they had been fighting for 7 years. That's called the Newburgh Conspiracy. And Washington puts it down and he establishes civilian control of the military, which is essential to the safety of our republic. And for the past 250 years, the Army has abided by civilian control of the military. Even if we don't agree, Douglas MacArthur didn't agree with his commander-in-chief, Harry Truman during the Korean War. It doesn't matter. The president is the civilian authority, the commander-in-chief. He calls the shots. He sets the policy. And that's why Douglas MacArthur was fired. But that tradition comes from George Washington. And if George Washington had just, given in and said, okay, you're right, I'll be king for a year, 5, whatever, it would have been over. We would not be the United States of America. So he's number one. Okay, so I can get my composure back again. So number 2, George Marshall, just an amazing man, a graduate of VMI. So he's an ROTC man, okay, graduate of VMI and the chief of staff of the Army in the Second World War. He is responsible for running a global war. This has never been done before. Nobody knows, how do you do this? The nation has been in depression. There's a lot of Americans who think that we should not be involved in World War II. And Marshall, as early as 1939 and 1940, is already laying the groundwork for, how do we get the National Guard mobilized? How do we get them trained? How do we get the right leaders in the right places? And then when war comes, we're not ready, but we're better set to adapt to this global war. And throughout the the next 4 years, he is providing that essential advice to the president, Franklin Roosevelt, to help steer the country, through the Second World War, which includes, massive mobilization. It includes, how do you allocate resources between the Army and the Navy and the Air Force, and some of the major, really major strategic decisions of the war. And there comes a time where Roosevelt has to name the supreme commander of Operation Overlord, which is going to be D-Day, to attack France on June 6, 1944. And everybody in the world thinks it's going to be Marshall. It has to be Marshall. He's the most prominent, well-known, capable, competent soldier that the United States has. And Roosevelt doesn't want to do it. because he says, I can't, he said, I can't sleep at night if George Marshall's not in Washington, D.C. with me. So they're in Egypt at the time that this decision is being made, Marshall and the president. And, people are telling Marshall, it's going to be you. This is in December 1943. You're going to get called to go supervise Overlord. And everyone knows that Marshall wants to do this. He's earned it. This would be a tremendous opportunity for him. And then Marshall hears that the president is kind of like not sure. And Marshall says to everyone who will listen to him, he says, I will do whatever the president thinks is best. And he has an interview with Roosevelt, and Roosevelt tries to kind of, get Marshall to say, what do you want to do, Marshall? And Marshall just holds his ground. Mr. President, I will do whatever you think is best. He says it like 3 times. So the decision is the president's. Marshall is not going to influence it at all, even though everybody knows that it ought to be him. And finally, Roosevelt says, oh, thank goodness, because George, I can't live with you being out of Washington, D.C. So the president selects Dwight Eisenhower to be the supreme commander for D-Day, and Marshall remains in his place as chief of staff. And, anyone who writes the history of World War II, reads the history of World War II, you know that, wow, that was a great decision. That worked. So that was perfect. And what Marshall does, so to me, the selfless service aspect of Marshall is just incredible. And then after he retires, he's retired for barely a day, and President Truman calls him and says, I need to send you to China. And Marshall says, yes, sir, I'll be on the plane tomorrow. And Marshall goes to China, and he's there for a year and a half after World War II is over. And then he comes home and he's like, oh, finally I can retire. And then the Korean War starts, and Truman says to Marshall, I need you to be the Secretary of Defense. And Marshall says, yes, sir. And he goes and be the Secretary of Defense for a year. So just an incredible selfless service and a great example of competence and leadership. So those are the 2 Georges. Those are the soldiers I most admire.
I think that you'd pick 2 very well-deserving men too, because they do exemplify what it means to be almost, if there was a perfect officer, they do definitely resemble what a perfect officer would be. I think selfless service is a very big key to leading the Army over time. But
Right.
I just want one last question, and it's, what piece of advice would you give to young leaders today?
Leaders in the Army?
I would just say in general, just for
In
anyone on
general?
the podcast.
Yeah. Okay.
But yeah,
I think that a sense of humility is vitally important. Especially if you're coming out of college, you've gotten this great education, and you're ready to tackle whatever gets thrown at you. But just recognizing that what your own limitations are, and being open to other people's ideas, and building a team. And because I've found that those leaders that think that, oh, I know it all, I don't want to share, I want to kind of control everything. Those people they're not fun to be around. I don't like working for them, and ultimately they're not very effective. But if you retain a sense of humility and knowledge of your own limitations, and you're willing to listen and get input from others, and bring others with you as part of a team, you'll find that you will accomplish much more. And be sure to give credit, to those people that are on your team. Great
thank
question.
you, sir.
Yeah, Jonah.
Jewel?
Hello, Colonel, and thank you so much. Those were incredible stories and truths that you shared with us. I just have one quick question, and then we can get to the amazing audience questions. Happy birthday, Army. Could you please tell us an amazing accomplishment of the United States Army? And I don't know if that will be in combat or something else, but could you highlight an accomplishment that you'd like to share with us in the audience?
Well, there's a lot. I think that, I look back in the global war on terror, in the, the aftermath of 9/11, how the Army, and this includes the Army Reserve and the National Guard, nobody was ready for what was going to happen. But within a matter of days, the Army had brought together the active duty soldiers, the Reserve and National Guard had brought everyone together, and we were visible. Some of us maybe we're not old enough to remember, but you would go to the airport or train station, bus station, and you would see soldiers in uniform patrolling in these areas. And most of those soldiers, probably the overwhelming number of those soldiers, were reservists and National Guard. So it wasn't their full-time job to do that. They were being pulled away from their homes and families and jobs to go and secure the nation. Sorry, 9/11, yeah, it affected me personally. So this is really, really important. But to see ordinary Americans put everything aside and put on the uniform and go to reassure other Americans it was going to be okay, I thought that was just incredible. And then, the operations that immediately followed in Afghanistan, and people didn't even know where Afghanistan was. So that was just an amazing feat of organization and professional skill to get soldiers to these faraway places to do what they needed to do in the aftermath of 9/11. That was, I think, a very impressive achievement.
Thank you so much. And I want to pass the audience questions now. And then if there's time at the end, I could come back, but I think we've got some great audience questions I see. Thank you, Colonel.
Thanks, Joel.
Well, thank you, Jewel and Jonah and Wyatt and Jay and Colonel Gibby. It's just been such an honor to have you with us today. And we're just so appreciative of your service to our country. And we do have quite a few audience questions. Before I go to the audience questions, I want to thank our listeners on Las Vegas's KKVV 1060 AM on the radio dial. KKVV airs these podcasts, airs Constituting America's Constitutional Chats podcasts on Mondays at 6 p.m. Pacific. So thank you to everyone listening in Las Vegas. And first of all, Julianne Smith asked, can you explain the Army's song and what it means and when it was written and by who?
I would have to do a little bit of research on that. There was a time in my life when I knew that, but I can briefly state that the tune is actually taken from the Field Artillery Branch. And the original song was called "The Caissons Go Rolling Along." Caisson is a carriage that carries the artillery and its ammunition and powder and things like that. So it was based on the artillery being able to move, to move itself. And the Army, and sometime in the mid 20th century, thought that's a great song. I think it was Maxwell Taylor, who was an artilleryman by training, and said that would be a great Army song, and so reworked the wording to kind of indicate this progress from our proud history moving into the present and the future. But it is a catchy tune.
It is. And we were proud to open our show with it today. That was fun. And Rudy Melendez says, Colonel Gibby, thank you for your service. And thank you again. And Julianne Smith had one other question. She said, was George Marshall the creator of the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe? And why was that important?
Yes, he was. This was when he was the Secretary of State. So we're talking 1946, 1947, 48. And Europe, a couple of years after the war, was still struggling to recover. And from the perspective of the United States, we were virtually the only country in the world that hadn't been bombed or had armies, running all over it. So we had, our industry and our economy was relatively intact, but we had no one to trade with because everybody else was just still so devastated. So the brilliance of the Marshall Plan was a way. And by the way, this plan was offered to all nations that have been affected by the war. So this included the Soviet Union. It included the countries of Eastern Europe, such as Poland and Czechoslovakia, and even those who were under communist rule. It included everybody. The Eastern Bloc countries, countries that the Soviet Union had control over, opted out of the Marshall Plan, but almost all the rest of Western Europe opted into the plan. And that was a way for the United States to kind of recognize the mistakes of World War I when World War I was over, and to use American financing with these countries to allow them to build up their own industries and to give them some currency that they could use to then buy goods and services from other countries, to include the United States, to kind of develop this trade network, first regionally and then globally, to allow the world to recover from that. So yeah, that was George Marshall's a really brilliant gift, and it proved to be very wise. I would like to say one thing from the previous comment. Oftentimes people do say, thank you for your service when they see me in uniform. And to me, my response is usually, well, you're worth it. So I accept that. I accept, people thanking me, but I want them to know that, well, it's not just, it's greater than that. You're worth serving. You're worth protecting. And I want them to know that, as well as they want me to know that they appreciate that I'm serving.
Well, thank you. And I mean, that's really beautiful. Thank you. And Jill Cullis asks, in those same vein, she asks, while strategy and technology are important, can you speak about winning the heart and its impact in winning a battle? And Jill says, I know during the revolution that this was a key point to winning the war. And you touched on that a little bit with some of your
Yes.
stories about George Washington and his impassioned speeches that he made, and how he inspired our Revolutionary War soldiers to continue fighting even when they couldn't be paid. But could you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. One of my favorite quotations from Napoleon is, he said, the moral is to the physical as 3 is to 1. So in Napoleon's views, moral factors were 3 times, is relative, 3 times more important than physical factors. And I think that's true. I think one of the uniquenesses of the American Army, particularly in those times of our service where we relied on volunteers, and even other times, but particularly with volunteers, that it was so essential to capture the heart, to capture the commitment of an individual that would keep them in the American Revolution, or even in the Civil War, to keep them in the line of fire. And they can't run, they can't hide, they can't kneel down, they can't lay down because of the technology of the time. You had to fight standing up. And to see people around you getting shot or injured, but to keep your place in line and to continue to do what your officers were asking you to do, it takes an incredible level of commitment and morale and esprit de corps, and love, frankly, love for the people who are around you, because you don't want to let your buddies down. And people can say, well, you fight for patriotism or you fight for your cause, but most veterans, when it comes right down to it, when they talk about, I'm in a battle or I'm in a firefight, what they're thinking about is, I'm not going to let my buddy down. And I'm going to, do what I need to do because of the people who are around me. I know would do the same for me if the situation were reversed. And so that's essential. And the best leaders throughout our Army's history have been those who have been able to communicate at that level through their own example, through personal example. George Washington at Valley Forge, he was Your Excellency, but he spent every day with his soldiers and every day trying to get supplies and wagons and food and building shelters. And the troops saw that. They said, this man cares about us. You know, he cares that we're cold and we're hungry, and he's cold and hungry, and he's doing what he can using his own resources to help us. Because Valley Forge, that was really a bad time. And that was a time when the Army could have just kind of melted away and the revolution would have been over.
Yeah, the Army and George Washington's leadership really saved our country. And
Absolutely.
certainly wouldn't be here today without the United States Army. And Jay, I want to give you and Jonah a chance for some closing words here. We're almost at the top of the hour, and it's been so great to have y'all on special just for this episode and to celebrate the Army's 250th birthday. And I'd love to have y'all take us out with some last comments.
Well, first, I'd just like to thank Colonel Gibby for coming on and giving us such a great rundown in the history of the Army. And I would just comment, being a former soldier, a veteran with 2 sons serving today, I can say unequivocally that my service in the military, it was the pinnacle of my life in terms of what I'm proud of. And I know that there are millions of other veterans out there who feel the same. Your passion, Colonel Gibby, comes through. I share that same passion, even after I've been out of the military for a long time. And the importance of the 250th anniversary is that it is the history of the Army, and it's the fact that it continues to roll along that will continue to preserve peace and freedom, not only here in the United States, but around the world. So I thank everyone who serves and everyone who supports those who serve, because it's just vital for the future of our nation and the world.
Thank you for that.
And I was just going to say, again, thank you, Colonel Gibby, for coming on. It means a lot. I even considered West Point at a time. It just didn't work out. Ended up, like I said, went the ROTC route, but
Yeah.
still a second lieutenant now. I know my Army career is just now getting started. It's very
Yeah.
short, but I
Yeah.
commend you for your selfless service for, what did you say, 32 years, sir?
32 years. Yeah. Well,
Thank
you're very
you.
lucky. You're very lucky. You know, the soldiers out there, they crave good leadership and they will respond to it. So, you know, they're fantastic. They'll do anything you ask them to do. They're great Americans.
And
Go
I was
ahead.
just going to say, and I hope to live up to those standards too, and lead our sons and daughters. And thank you again.
You're welcome.
Well, and Jonah's a great leader. I've had a chance to observe him in many different situations. He's helped out on our winter trip in Washington, D.C. that we do with our student contest winners for several years. And he is definitely somebody that I would always want to have in my foxhole for sure. So he no matter how stressful the situation is, Jonah's calm and a great leader. So
Yeah, we call those our battle buddies.
yes,
And your
yes,
battle
for
buddy,
sure.
that
Never want to
critical.
let them down.
So this has been a great show. We want to thank our audience for being with us today. And again, thank you, Colonel Gibby. And we want to ask everyone to check out our book club. We dropped a link in the Q&A. It's Monday night, 7 o'clock Eastern. That'd be 6 p.m. Texas, 5 p.m. Mountain, and and 6 p.m. Central, not just Texas, but Central time, 5 p.m. Mountain and 4 p.m. Pacific. But we're going to have Tova Kaplan back, who longtime listeners of our podcast love to see Tova when she's on our panel. Tova's going to be leading the book club. It's on a book, The Return of George Washington. We've talked a lot about George Washington today. It's The Return of George Washington by Edward Larson. And you don't have to have read the book to join us. So we hope you'll hop on Monday night at 7 o'clock with us, say hi to Tova, and join in our book club. So thank you, everyone, again, and happy 250th. And Jorn, I don't know, can you take us out with the Army song one more time? And maybe not.
Yes, I can.
Great. Thank you very much.
Just got to make sure.
Fine.